serious right now? Really?
Mochi, you're a big, strong cat. All right, folks, well, it is 7:42, so I'm going to get started here, even though we only have 18 people. Hopefully some more will show up as the class progresses. So let me switch over to my desktop here and get going. We're going to finish up by talking about the Russian Revolution today, and just to bring you back to where we left off last week. At the end of last week, we had talked about, just the last couple of slides here, we had talked about the new economic policy. Remember that the new economic policy was that plan that before he died, Vladimir Lenin was trying to get the economy in Russia back on the right track after that failed war communism policy that he had put into place that rapidly took the government under war communism rapidly took control over the entire economy, all factors of production, land, labor, and capital. It started regulating all private companies, businesses, factories, etc., farms, and it failed miserably. So Lenin, out of fear that his own revolution would, be revolted against, he needed to win back the support of the workers, and he instituted the new economic policy as a way to restore some elements of capitalism and private enterprise. In other words, private businesses, right? Ones that are not controlled by the government. And that's all that private means, by the way. If you are talking about a private company, it's simply one that the company runs itself. It makes its own decisions, it hires its own people, it makes its own products, etc. When it's public, that means that it's run by the government for the people. And so, this is the difference between those two terms. And then we talked about how Vladimir Lenin died. I told you about how his body was embalmed and is still, as far as I understand, still on display in Moscow. And after Lenin died, we talked about that power vacuum where Leon Trotsky, who would have probably been the hand-selected person appointed to take over by Vladimir Lenin when he died, Leon Trotsky finds himself exiled and murdered in Mexico thanks to the cunning and ruthless political tactics of this other guy, Joseph Stalin. And I mentioned to you last class as well that Joseph Stalin was one of these guys who is truly, I mean, the symbol of Russia is a sickle and hammer during the Soviet Union years, right? It's displayed right here on this slide in the background. Okay, a sickle and hammer. And if there was one way I could describe if there's one way I could describe Joseph Stalin, okay, he is as bent as the sickle and as hard as the hammer that crosses it. He is really just a diabolical individual. And he is able to gain control of the Soviet Union through basically eliminating via purges and assassinations and so on anyone who would have posed a threat to his rule. So Joseph Stalin, here he is early in his life, here he is late in his life. We looked at that last class too. And we left off on this slide, the 5-year plan. Okay, so when Joseph Stalin comes to power in Russia in 1928, he immediately does away with Vladimir Lenin's NEP. We talked about that before. He ended the NEP and he reinstituted a command economy. So he essentially turns back the Soviet Union, aka Russia, back into a completely communist command economy where the government controls all aspects of the economy. And he did this so that he could implement his new plan, which was known as the 5-year plan. And there were actually 2 5-year plans. There was a first 5-year plan, and then there was a second 5-year plan. And the goal of them was to rapidly industrialize Russia. And when what they're trying to do here, see, what you have to remember about Russia at the start of the 20th century, the 1900s, okay? The thing about Russia is that it, compared to, say, a place like England or Germany or France or Belgium or anywhere else in Western Europe, okay, Russia was really pretty far behind when it came to industrialization. They did have some things. They had decent steel production and stuff, but in terms of the total industrialization of the state and the number of people living and working in urban areas at factories and stuff like that, Russia was behind. There was a lot of the economy of Russia in the 1910s, 1920s was still largely very, very agrarian. There were a lot of people living in the vast countryside of Russia, okay? They did not live in these big, sprawling urban cities like New York City or, London or Paris or something like that. Russia has Moscow and they have St. Petersburg, which are 2 relatively large cities, but the vast majority of the population doesn't live in those cities at this time. They live across the rest of the massive, massive country that Russia is. And so this plan was meant to try to encourage the development of Russia's industry and turn the Soviet Union from an agricultural country to a leading industrial power. He wanted to increase economic productivity, particularly what's known as heavy industry. Heavy industry refers to the kinds of industry like where you're making building materials. Some of industrialization is for things like consumer goods, things that you buy and use and consume at home. That's really how we usually think of industrialization here in the United States, is that factories were churning out consumer goods, stuff that people could buy and use, whether that be like clothing or home amenities, clocks and blankets and furniture and other things like that. That is not going to be the focus of the 5-year plan. The focus of the 5-year plan put a special emphasis on what's called heavy industry. That's referring to things like building materials, okay? Giant concrete slabs, K-bars, iron I-bars to use for the construction of buildings, of machinery, and so on. Like big, heavy industry sorts of things. Shipbuilding, railways, things like that. And few consumer goods were made. Now, here's the thing. The 5-year plan it is not really very successful, especially the first one. The goals aren't met. The one good thing that it does do is it puts a lot of people to work, and but the downside of it is, although people have jobs, because one of the major ways that we measure how healthy the economy is doing is to look at how many people are employed. The unemployment rate, when it gets too high, can be an indicator that your economy is not doing so well. And so like, for example, back in 2008, 2009, the United States went through a recession, an economic recession. And it had a whole lot to do with the banking industry and the housing crisis that happened. And what happened during that time is a lot of people lost their homes and their jobs. And the unemployment rate went up to somewhere in the area nationally of about 8 to 9%, which is several percentages higher than what it typically sits at, which is usually around 5%. So when you have unemployment go up, that can be an indicator that things are going bad. Now, during this time, in 1929, the same year that Stalin initiates his 5-year plan, happens to be the same year that in October of 1929, the United States has a financial disaster hit when the stock market crashes. And this, we can talk a little bit about why that happens later on when we get to the interwar years. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on the crash of the stock market right now, because that's part of the next unit that we'll be looking at. But suffice it to say, what ends up happening is when the Great Depression hits after the stock market crashes in 1929, in the United States, the unemployment rate skyrockets to 25%. Now, that is a really, really high unemployment rate, okay? Like 25%. That means that 1 in 4 adults are jobless, which means that they aren't making money, can't afford to pay rent, can't afford to buy themselves basic necessities, okay? So 25% unemployment rate is really, really alarming. That is bad, okay? You do not want an unemployment rate that high. And what is interesting about that is that, here's the thing. When the stock market crashes here in the United States and the unemployment rate is so high, people start to get fearful, right? They start to get a little bit, they get really concerned, because economic downturns can really be demoralizing for the people. It can really put people on edge because, they lose where they're living and they can't afford to eat, and it can be absolutely devastating. And what is interesting is that because the Soviet Union had turned to communism, their unemployment rate had remained really, really low. And Western nations, people of Western nations, started looking at the Soviet Union and saying, wow, that this is kind of concerning, because here we've been priding ourselves on having, a capitalist democratic state where our economy is free and the people are free and we have freedom of speech and all of these other things. And now look what's happened. The Great Depression has struck, unemployment is at 25%, the working class is really struggling, and they're starting to look over at Russia. And it kind of reminds me of that meme. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that meme of the guy that's like walking with his girlfriend, and then there's another girl that's like walking by in the opposite direction and he's like looking back. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that meme before, but you could easily make a meme out of the Americans and the rest of Western Europe with that meme of them like being married to capitalism and democracy when the stock market crashes, and then them looking back, or the guy looking back at Russia, who, unemployment rate is close to zero, and it seems really appealing because seemingly on the surface, people can't believe that Russia has been able to put all of these people to work and try at least to rapidly industrialize. Here's the thing, though, is that there was nothing glamorous about the situation going on in Russia at that time. It would have been easy for people to think like, oh wow, what if communism starts spreading to the rest of the world? The people that were in power in Western Europe, in the governments of Britain and France and even all the way over in America, start to get really, really worried that the working classes of their respective countries would try to turn those countries into communist states, because they understood that communism in Russia was putting people to work, and the rest of the people of Europe are living in the Great Depression at this time, and they're thinking, well, why can't I go to work? How come the government's not making jobs for me? And those kinds of questions. All right? But they don't see the fact that while people were going to work in Russia, the government was also taking away all of their freedoms, all of their privately owned land, and creating massive collective farms called communes, which is part of the way that we get the word communism, okay, whose profits were supposed to be shared by the farmers and all of this other stuff. So the philosophy behind communism allowed people to go to work, but it also meant that they had to sacrifice a whole lot. And that's bad, right? We wouldn't want to see that spread to America. And so during the 1930s, there's all this propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, that starts to spread around to dissuade or turn people away from looking at communism as a viable solution to the unemployment rate going that was so high during the Great Depression. So during the 5-year plan, another thing to keep in mind is that consumer goods were almost non-existent. In other words, if you wanted to purchase things for yourself, for your own personal use, stuff that you would put in your house, maybe like whatever, little knick-knacky kinds of things, clocks, furniture, silverware, plates, all those kinds of things that we consider consumer goods, stuff that you personally buy and use for yourself. They are basically non-existent, which again goes back to this idea of, yeah, people are working, but what's the point of working if you're never able to purchase anything that you really need, because there's no products out there for people to buy. So even though they're employed, it's not that good of a situation. Meanwhile, of course, America and Europe are stuck in the Great Depression, and people start freaking out about the spread of communism beyond the Soviet Union. One of the things that worked in their favor is that the Soviet Union under Stalin was not even though he's a totalitarian dictator, even though he is a communist, okay, what you have to understand is that he's not a Marxist communist. Unlike Vladimir Lenin, unlike Leon Trotsky, who more or less were pretty staunch in their views of communism, being closely connected to Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, right? Joseph Stalin is not that kind of guy. Joseph Stalin has one concern and one concern only, and that is becoming the most powerful man in Russia, and staying the most powerful man in Russia. He is not concerned with taking the Russian Revolution and trying to get it to spread across the planet, okay? So he's not super interested in taking the communist revolution and spreading it outside the boundaries of Russia. He's completely fine with just simply maintaining communism in his country and leaving it at that, because Russia is already so massive. So the first 5-year plan fails, as I mentioned. Russia does not meet their heavy industry goals. So 5 years, 1929, 30, 31, 32, and 33, okay, it fails. And so when it fails, Joseph Stalin steps in and he says, okay, well, that didn't work, but we're going to institute a new 5-year plan. So the second 5-year plan starts in 1933. And in particular, the focus on this 5-year plan was also on heavy industry, but with a special emphasis on military industry. Okay? The other thing that Stalin did is he wrote a quote-unquote constitution, which is really funny because he's a totalitarian dictator. Okay, he's above the law. He does whatever he wants. But he wrote a constitution to make it seem like he was some sort of legitimately elected leader. All right, the constitution that he wrote was nothing but words on paper. It had no weight, it was not followed, and it certainly didn't guarantee any rights to the people the way that our constitution does. Stalin held all power by the time that 1933 rolls around. Okay, there is not one legitimate challenger that could potentially take Stalin out of power. He is the supreme leader of Russia at this time. One of the ways in which Joseph Stalin consolidates his power is by fighting against his own party, even other communists, okay? And the way that this is, you guys have probably heard of that ridiculous movie, The Purge, of which they've made now several sequels, each of them dumber than the last. However, that word purge is an actual historical term. And in Soviet Union history, under Joseph Stalin, he conducted something known as the Great Purge. And it's not that far off from that ridiculous movie. In that movie, the idea was that one day a year, in case you've never seen The Purge, the way that it works is that one day a year, there are no laws, and it's just full-blown chaos, and everybody is going around, murdering each other and breaking into each other's houses and vandalizing things and so on and so forth. Okay? The way that the Great Purge worked in real life was that Stalin utilized a secret police organization known as the Cheka, Cheka, the Cheka. And the Cheka was able to collect information from suspected competitors to Stalin's authority. And so Joseph Stalin starts spying on his own party members. He starts sending people off to the gulags, which were labor camps, basically concentration camps, where you'd be chopping down wood in the vast tundra of Siberia for the rest of your life, which wouldn't have been long because you would have probably died from disease in the elements or exhaustion, and otherwise just killing them and making them disappear and those kinds of things. And this Great Purge results in the removal, and I mean, like, in many cases, killings, of all suspected opposition from their positions of authority. So by 1939, within 10 years of Joseph Stalin coming to power, the Great Purge left 8 million Soviet citizens in labor camps. 8 million people sent off to work in prison camps, literally prison camps, which, by the way, this still happens. Not in Russia, so far as we know, but in North Korea, you bet it does. Okay, people in North Korea, if you're suspected of being a threat or even just not being excited enough about Kim Jong-un's rule, you can be shipped off to any one of many, many labor camps in North Korea where you're just working the rest of your life. Never see your family again or anything like that. Okay, it may as well be a life sentence. And so, 8 million people in labor camps and another 3 million dead. I want you to just consider that. Okay, imagine a leader of a government directly or indirectly leading to the deaths of 3 million people, okay, and another 8 million being put into labor camps. These are unfathomably huge numbers of people who are being treated just terribly, disregarded by the state, discredited by the state, and in many cases killed by the state. All right, it's pretty horrible. So here you can see Joseph Stalin, this guy in the black trench coat to the left and behind Joseph Stalin was a guy named Molotov. And was it Sergei Molotov? I think it's Sergei Molotov. Oh, no, it's Vyacheslav Molotov. They always have unique Russian names. Okay, Vyacheslav Molotov, okay, was this guy's name. And he was one of the close inner circle guys of Joseph Stalin, okay? And so anyhow, he's a younger dude at the time, but anyhow, yeah. He lived to be 96 years old. Molotov was around for a very long time. But anyhow, Vyacheslav Molotov, that was this guy back here. And he was one of the few people who was in Stalin's inner circle. But of course you have to, I mean, if I was him, I would be worried at all times. I would have been stressed out, because the second that Stalin thought that you were trying to compete with him, you were gone. That was just how they did things. Here is a photograph of what a Soviet prison camp in Siberia looks like. As you can see, it would be back-breaking labor. All right, and this was the result for anyone who was deemed a political threat to Stalin, or a dissident, somebody who went against the Communist Party, or even just wasn't enthusiastic enough about the Communist Party or Joseph Stalin or whatever. They could find themselves in these gulags, a very, very long way from home, in a very, very bad situation. Okay, the next little part, and we will go into more detail about totalitarianism in our next unit, but I do want to just, because this is the first totalitarian ruler that we're going to be talking about in this class, I did want to just take a minute to talk to you a little bit about totalitarianism and what it is. Okay, now totalitarianism takes more than one form in terms of politics. To give you an idea of what I mean, okay, in a democratic nation where we have political parties, we have elections, that means that people are able to show up at the polls, vote for who they want to represent them, and those political parties take office, oftentimes for limited terms and stuff like that. There's a lot of freedom. People have the freedom of speech. There's a lot of private companies and things like that. If either the far left or the far right end up completely taking over the government, what can happen when extreme political parties take power is that they begin to eliminate anyone who disagrees with their political party. But I want to emphasize to you that these two symbols here that you're seeing, okay, the sickle and hammer is the symbol of the Soviet Union, okay, it's the symbol of communism. Communism, in terms of the political spectrum, okay, if we're talking about the political spectrum, and when I say the political spectrum, I'm simply talking about, let's just see if I can find a quick thing here. Totalitarianism political spectrum. Let's see if I can find a decent image here to kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about. Not that. Let's see here. This is kind of it, I guess, a little bit. I wish it was a little more thorough. Maybe this one. Let's do this one. Okay. So, all right, this is a pretty decent image here. All right, check this one out. Okay, this image here demonstrates to you kind of just how radical either side can get. Okay, when we look at the left side over here, the left wing, all right, if we get super far to the left towards communism, notice that they say slavery here. Instead of using the word slavery, let's replace the word slavery with totalitarian on either side. Because that's what ends up happening. When you have a middle ground where your government is democratic, there are free elections, there's capitalism, and things like that. You're in the middle. That's where people are free and people are happy and the quality of their life typically goes up and all of these things. As you start to move to the far, far right over here, okay, we start to move towards things like Nazism and fascism. And as we move further over to the right, the same way, if we move further over to the extremes of the left over here towards communism, notice that they are on opposite sides. Communists and fascists are basically on exact polar opposite sides of the political spectrum. However, the thing that they have in common is that if you move all the way to the left and establish communism, you are creating a totalitarian government. If you move all the way over to the right and create a fascist government, you are creating a totalitarian government. They result in the same stripping of people's liberties, okay? And okay. So anyhow, let's talk about some aspects of what is totalitarianism. We now know, so basically the thing that you should have taken away from this slide, guys, is that totalitarianism can happen either from far left policies or from far right policies. Far left being communism, far right being fascism or Nazism. Okay? Totalitarianism. When a state becomes totalitarian, it controls every aspect of life. There is no private sphere anymore. What do I mean by saying there's no private sphere? Well, in many cases, they crack down on people's private lives, okay? You are not allowed to say anything that you want. If you come out and say something against the government by writing an editorial in a newspaper or posting something online these days or whatever it is, even just having a conversation with your neighbor, all right, you can never assume that your conversation will stay private. The state has every ability to spy on you, to use your words against you, even to make up evidence against you and put you in a gulag, in a prison camp. Okay? There are no independent organizations. All organizations are controlled and monitored very closely by the state. Well, Arnav, yeah, but no, because Arnav, here's the thing. The news, I would disagree with you on that one. I think the news is actually pretty brutally uncensored in a way. The news is catered, it's curated, but I wouldn't say it's censored. When we talk about censorship, I need to be clear that when I say censorship, I'm talking about the government telling the news what they can and can't publish. Okay, and we do not live in that situation today, as evidenced by the fact that the news has been very openly critical of the government. Okay, and if some of the news stories that you see run in the United States were to be run in say the Soviet Union, whoever reported the news, the entire news station would have been completely shut down. Everybody there would have been purged. They would have been sent off to gulags and so on. But no one would have been stupid enough to ever make a news report that criticized the government, because it would have been a death sentence. And so I don't necessarily agree with you that the news is censored. The press in our yeah, but that's not news. Talking against feds and social media, especially Twitter getting taken down. You mean like Trump's Twitter getting taken down? I mean, here's the thing about that is Arnav, I'm going to tell you about a thing, and I hope that you're listening carefully to this. There's something that happens. I think that freedom of speech is absolutely essential. Okay, I think that freedom of speech is absolutely essential, but the other side of the freedom of speech is that just because somebody says something doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that I have to value their opinion. And when you think about social media companies are private companies. Okay, Twitter is a private, yes, Jacob, exactly. Twitter's a private company. Facebook's a private company. Instagram is owned by Facebook. Okay, TikTok, private company. All these are private companies. They can choose, it's their platform. They own it. They can choose whatever they want to have happen on it. That's their right as a private company owner. The difference is that the news stations, okay, which are different than social media, all right, they are able to criticize the government without, what censorship is when news stations are not allowed to print stories that are critical of the government because the government prevents them from being able to do so. That's censorship. Private companies can choose whatever they want. You're talking about two different things, okay? Twitter blocking Trump isn't censorship. That's just them not allowing misinformation to spread around on their platform, which they have every right to do. So that's the difference. Okay, and the other thing is, dude, the government is. Have you ever watched how brutal the evening late shows are against the, did you ever see any, like Jimmy Fallon, Seth Meyers, any of those guys over the last 4 years? All they do is tear Trump to pieces, but they have the right to do that because they have freedom of speech, right? And so the government is criticized all the time, but they can do it without fear of winding up in a labor camp because we have rights that are guaranteed to the people here. Okay, I think that you're severely underestimating just how unbelievably brutal the oppression of a totalitarian regime is. We really do not at all live in a totalitarian government, and I think that it would be a real shame for people to think that we did. Yes, that is correct. You can say right now, government equals bad, and I legally criticize the government. Yes, you did. That's good. And that's your opinion. Like I said, I mean, if that's what you believe, that's what you believe. Far be it from me to tell you what you think. But freedom of speech goes both ways, man. It's two directional. So, if you say something, just like Arnav, we're practicing Arnav right now, freedom of speech and open discourse in class right now. You should feel lucky that you're able to express yourself, put ideas out there, and have me be able to listen to them and respond to you. But it goes both ways. If you pose to me an idea, that doesn't mean that I just have to take your idea as fact. I'm going to come back with my own counter argument, because that's what freedom of speech is all about. Well, I wouldn't be mad because I'm not about to let that ruin my day. But it just wouldn't do you any good, That's the thing. Like, I don't care what you say, like that doesn't affect me. Your words would not change my life. I would go about my day as if it never happened. All right. So the other thing is that they oftentimes outlaw religion. That's another aspect of totalitarian governments. So there is no religion. Famously in China, they got rid of religion completely. They dominate the economy. They dominate education. They dominate business. They dominate newspapers. They dominate clubs, churches. There is literally no civil society at all, okay, in totalitarian governments. The entire society is rigidly controlled and oppressed by the government. Regimes that were totalitarian in history, and these are not the only ones, but these are some of the better known ones. Nazi Germany, of course, under Adolf Hitler from 1933 to 1945. The Soviet Union under Stalin remained totalitarianism from 1925 until 1953. China under communist leader Mao Zedong from 1949 all the way up until 1970. Cambodia under a totalitarian political organization known as the Khmer Rouge. And then Cuba under Fidel Castro from 1959 to 2007, as well as, of course, and this is kind of cut off down here, let me reduce the size of this text here. Of course, North Korea, now under the leadership of Kim Jong-un. But North Korea has been totalitarian since Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was in power starting in 1953. All right. So, dictators. Joseph Stalin on the left there, Adolf Hitler in the middle there, and then Mao Zedong on the right. And as we move into the next unit, those names are going to come up again. We're not going to get into all the history on Hitler or Mao Zedong right now, but we will talk more about Hitler later on. Okay, what's the logic of totalitarianism? Why would a state go towards totalitarianism? Okay, why would it ever happen in the first place? Because these leaders are trying to exert control to create a perfect society out of imperfect people. Okay, there's a high level of control of every part of life. The idea behind totalitarianism is if you just take enough people's freedoms away from them and institute a high level of control of every part of life, you can make the society more perfect. Unfortunately, of course, the part of totalitarianism that is the cost that comes with it is that when all of these levels of control are instituted, no one has any freedom anymore. Coercion. Coercion is used against all perceived threats. All right. What is coercion? Let me give you an example of coercion. The mafia frequently would use coercion back in the olden days. Let's say that you're just like a regular bakery owner. You're living in New York City in the 1920s, 1930s. You're just a bakery owner. You're not even involved in the mafia. Okay? But let's say some guys from the mafia show up at your bakery one day and they say to you, hey, you look like you could use some protection. And you're like, well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm pretty safe here. And then they start breaking everything in your store. And they say back to you, you look like you could use some protection. Otherwise, stuff like this could happen. And then you're like, what are you going to do? They're the mafia, right? So they come in and they say, we will offer your store protection, okay? But you have to give us, whatever, 20% of your earnings every month, okay? So we're going to come by here every month and collect our cut, and that will be protection from the other rival mob families in the area. Okay, that's coercion because you're forcing somebody to do something against their will, okay? And you're using threat of violence against them to get them to do what you want. That's what coercion is, okay? Coercion, by the way, is illegal, okay? Coercion in the United States, coercion's illegal. If you coerce somebody, a milder form of coercion would be blackmail. Maybe you've ever heard of blackmail before. Let's say somebody, you know, you knew something, or you had like a secret or something like that, and you didn't want it to get out. Like, let's say somebody had like an affair with their spouse, and somebody finds out about it, and they say, you got to pay me $2 million or else I'm going to put your secret out there. That's blackmail. That's illegal. Okay, but that's a form of coercion as well. And so literally in totalitarian governments, the government is coercing the people. Okay, they're using coercion against anyone who would potentially be a threat to their power, or even just a perceived threat to their power. And of course, they're trying to eliminate all possibility of revolt by using the military to crack down and enforce control. The leader of a totalitarian state, most leaders of totalitarian states have the following attributes in common with one another. They have to be perceived by the people as supreme and autonomous. What I mean by autonomous is self-governing. Okay, in other words, the very, 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 very top of the political ladder. Okay, no one else has authority over them. The leader of a totalitarian state is the supreme leader, and his power is completely determined by him and him alone. Okay, all decisions are made by the supreme leader. They are often worshipped by many of the people of that nation as a hero of the state, as somebody who is there to rescue the people who are fearful or unemployed or have low quality of life or low standards of living. Usually the hero is able to convince a sizable portion of the population that they are the only person who can rescue all of the people who are struggling in the nation. Okay, so anyone who is angry enough, fearful enough, upset enough, riotous enough, okay, they are going to look to the leader to provide stability and create conditions that will improve their own lives. Of course, what they don't realize is that the leader could, in all cases, the leaders of totalitarian nations really don't care very much at all for the common man, okay, and are perfectly willing, once they come to power, to strip the common man's rights away from him, and and really be a pretty oppressive and ruthless leader. The other thing about the leaders of totalitarian states is typically they are perceived as wise, paternal, meaning fatherly, and charismatic. A lot of times, these leaders are talented speech givers. They are seen as having a pulse on the concerns of the people and stuff like that. But they manipulate using propaganda and fancy speeches that are deliberately worded and stuff to mislead folks, to manipulate the population into being subservient to them. And this is the danger of following strong men like this, is that they are really good at preying on people's concerns, their fears, their anxieties. And when they prey on their concerns and fears and anxieties and gain more and more and more support, eventually what ends up happening is that as they gain enough support, these people then turn right around and start eliminating anyone who is considered to be a threat to their power. Features of totalitarianism, they always prey upon the popular fears and prejudices of the people. They will always be able to provide excuses for past wrongs. You know, that's the other thing that they do in, that they do in their speeches. So, for example, with Joseph Stalin's 5-year plan, the first one failed. But what he will do is he'll say, oh, well, we failed to meet our goals for the first 5-year plan. Clearly, this is as a result of, and then they start naming X, Y, Z things that have nothing to do with why it failed. And they start pointing the finger at, oh, well, if it wasn't for these political dissidents who are challenging the state, or if it wasn't for this political party, or if it wasn't for this ethnic group, or if it wasn't for so-and-so, okay, they start pointing the finger and scapegoating and blaming other groups for why the state has failed, rather than ever taking responsibility. And of course, people believe it because the state is using things that people are fearful of against them to manipulate them and get them to believe that that the threat somehow isn't the government, but instead probably something that isn't really a threat at all. So they provide excuses for past wrongs. They also explain the current sacrifices. Yes, of course your life is miserable today. Of course we're miserable. Okay, we're behind the rest of the world in industrialization. But it's only through hard work and sacrifice to the state that Germany will ever be great, or Russia will ever be great, or whatever. Okay, so they start preaching about, how, yeah, maybe you're only living on, government rations. Maybe your only meal for the entire week has been a single loaf of bread and water. But you know what? Those are the kinds of sacrifices that we all need to make in order to make our state great. Okay? And of course, people believe it, in a lot of cases. Not all the time, but it comes to a point where even if you don't believe it, you're certainly not going to question it, because that would mean that you would be the next person to find yourself chopping down trees in Siberia at the Russian gulags. They always make glowing promises of the future. One day, when we put in enough sacrifice, when enough people have died, when enough people have one day we will emerge at the top of the world. They always make these huge glowing promises of future wealth, future peace. Yes, there may be war, there may be chaos today, but one day there won't be, when enough people have died and when enough people have sacrificed and worked hard and they never ever can really celebrate any victories, because they're always getting people to believe that the next victory is just around the next corner. They make their own revolutions legitimate. So, of course, whenever they come to power, they usually write a constitution and hold a mock vote to say, oh, see, I'm the legitimate ruler, you guys voted me in, when in reality, of course, they just completely ran a coup d'etat and overthrew the state. And then there's, of course, heavy reliance on propaganda. So they're using posters, they're using movies, they're using radio, they're using government-run news stations to get people to believe bigger and bigger and bigger lies about reality. And this reliance on propaganda is something that is wielded like a sword by particularly the Nazis in Germany in the years leading up to World War II. Okay, the organization of the government. As soon as totalitarianism is put into place, what ends up happening is that the government party that is in charge outlaws all other political parties who would challenge them. So we enter into what's called single party rule, single political party rule. And they serve the leader of the state who controls the entire political party. So you've got this totalitarian leader, and you've got this entire structure of a political party behind them, and the leader of the party is also keeping an eye on their own political party, just like Joseph Stalin did with the Great Purge, to make sure that no one within the political party threatens their rule, okay? The party might be initially powerful, but over time, what ends up happening in a totalitarian state is that the leader becomes far, far more powerful than the party. And so the political party initially may be able to make choices about who becomes the next leader. But when they become the leader, eventually the leader themselves starts to crack down on their own political party, and the party sees their power lost to the leader of the party. In time, no dissent at all is allowed. Even within the party, there is no dissent. Everybody has to follow what the leader says. The other thing that happens a lot of times in totalitarian states is that because the population becomes so radicalized, very extreme, either far left or far right in their views, there's people who are fanatics of the ruler. Let's say, like the most racist and worst war criminals of World War II under Adolf Hitler. Guys like Hermann Goering and other people like this, who we'll learn about later. These fanatical followers will make any sacrifice necessary, and you have entire armies in Germany under Hitler that were made up of kids who had been brought up in like, for example, the Hitler Youth, where they, from the time that they were very, very young, were brainwashed to believe what the state told them. And these fanatical followers end up joining into the military and committing terrible war crimes during World War II in the name of serving the leader. And these people are so fanatical, they're so extremized in their views, that they literally believe that that by killing innocent people, that they're doing a good thing, that they're doing the right thing. And that's the thing that's so alarming about totalitarianism, in particular Nazism, is that these poor people in Germany ended up being swindled by their leader. And there were many, many, many questions after World War II about how in the world did these people go down this path of extremism? How in the world did they get suckered into believing what Hitler was saying about Jewish folks and about all, everything, really, anything having to do with the racial superiority? And the fact of the matter is, the reason that they went for it is because the economy of Germany did improve under Hitler, and so people believed that because their lives were getting better, that he really was the solution to Germany's problems. But it came along with all of the most extreme and brutal practices that the Nazis and crimes that the Nazis committed against many minorities in their population. So the totalitarian regime begins to use the military to mobilize, in other words, get into position to attack any threat, internal or external, and they begin to use aggressive warfare to keep the people mobilized. They also utilize secret police. Totalitarian dictatorships often utilize secret police organizations, such as the SS, which was the Schutzstaffel, or the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, was the name of the secret police organization in Nazi Germany. In Russia, you had the Cheka, which eventually becomes the KGB. Here in the United States, we kind of have our own quasi-secret police organizations but that would be things like the CIA, the FBI, maybe the NSA, and other things like that. I guess those could be considered kind of secret police. Not quite the same, because secret police, usually they are breaking the law technically and oppressing people and taking away their rights and other things like that. I guess it could happen. I don't know. We don't really know. But they use the military to internally monitor the civilians. They oftentimes will use terror and violence because it makes taking over places easier, because people become so fearful that they stop resisting. It creates a perpetual atmosphere of crisis and instability. And the thing is that this is exactly the kind of environment that allows strong dictators to come to power. They want to create chaos. They want to create a situation of instability, because when you create a situation of instability, the entire population becomes very, very fearful. And they are, people, as I've talked about before, people want stability. People want routine. They don't want instability. They don't want chaos. The only people who want chaos and instability are the people who are looking to completely take over the government, okay? And so when we look back at Stalin, when we look back at Hitler, when we look back at Mao Zedong and other people across the world who have taken over and created totalitarian countries, they have deliberately tried to create a state of chaos within their respective countries. Because by doing so, it makes it easier to be the person who says, look at how bad things have gotten. You need someone who's strong that will straighten all of this out. Okay? And they end up dramatizing and exaggerating and using propaganda to exploit the inability of the former government that they are trying to get rid of in order and their ability to handle the problems. So to give you a classic example of this, let me just tell you what I mean by this. During the interwar years, and we'll talk about this again next unit, but I'm just going to talk about it now because it serves as a good example of this point. During the interwar years, Adolf Hitler went to the Reichstag, which is the governmental, think of it like the Capitol. Okay, Adolf Hitler went to the Reichstag and had his henchmen burn the Reichstag down. Okay, they literally light the Reichstag on fire, the government building on fire. They then the next day they come out and they say, look what happened. The Reichstag got burned down by the communists. Okay, so they blame the opposite political party and they say, we wouldn't have these problems with communism if it weren't for the inability of the government of Germany under the Weimar Republic to handle Germany's problems. So they literally were the ones that burned down, the Nazis burned down the Reichstag, then they turn around, they lie about it to the population, and simultaneously blame the current government, which they're trying to overthrow, for not being able to handle the problems faced by the state. And this is very, very, very manipulative, but it's also extremely effective. Okay? So, anyhow, the population stays terrorized and thus stays under the control of the leader. And my last slide of the day before I wrap things up is talking about just terror and violence. The leaders of these totalitarian states typically become such megalomaniacs, such egomaniacs, so convinced of their supreme authority that they eliminate not just enemies, but actually even people who are loyal to them that may just one day down the line become competition. Okay, so these dictators are really full-blooded sociopaths, and what I mean by that is these are people who do not have a conscience. Okay, it takes a really specific kind of person, somebody who is truly just cutthroat and ruthless, to be one of these totalitarian rulers, because it takes an extreme disregard for the well-being of mankind. They are usually supreme narcissists. What I mean by narcissists is that they believe they are legitimately better than every other human being on the planet. Okay, and it doesn't even cross their mind that they might be wrong once in a while, or they might have made a mistake once in a while. These people don't function that way because they are seriously mentally unstable. Okay, these people are truly just, you know, predatorial people that prey on other humans. Okay, and all for the aggrandizement of their own power. So, folks, that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'd just like to say thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.